Hey everyone, and welcome to this treatment of the second house. This is the second in a series that we're doing over the houses, and I hope that this provides some really solid ground from which to understand how to interpret the second house, how to look at it, generally speaking, how to consider the impact of the sign or signs that is in that house, how to look at the planets in that house, the ruler of that house. We're not going to get into the nitty-gritty of all of the house rulership things yet. We're going to do that much more in depth in a different session. But this should give us a sense of what topics are we looking at? What considerations do we have when we're looking at the second house? And in particular, when I was doing my research over this again, I have long considered the second house, the way that I speak of it or the way that I imagine it is of the garden, because it makes the most sense to me. It basically speaks to all of the different aspects that come into this house, in my view, and we're going to talk about those. And to me, it highlights and honors virtually the entire tradition of astrology and different viewpoints of this house and all of the different things that we tend to see with this house. So we're going to get into the kind of older definitions, get a little bit into the history of this house and how it came to signify what it does in modern astrology, but you'll also wind up seeing from the headings of all of our different kind of tabs that we're going to go through here of wealth and livelihood, and this being something that can be derived from our gardens, the personal resource of the garden and the safety and security of the garden, the value and what is valued within the garden. What is it? What are the seeds that we plant? And what is the value of how we tend to that ground? But it also then speaks to the way that classical authors tended to look at this house. And they really took a look at, because they were dealing with astrology without programs, without computer programs, they were doing it through the sky and through physical instruments. So there was so much getting your hands into what does this literally look like in the earth or from the perspective of the earth. And so there's so much to the meaning of the houses of the ancient authors that are highly reflective of what's actually going on with planets when they're going through a specific house. And so just to give a fascinating to me, but somewhat unrelated example of that, this is part of where the 12th house gets its complicated notions from, is that the 12th house is that area of the sky where the planets appear to be trying to reach up to the midheaven, trying to climb up to the midheaven in the course of the day, because of the fact that the eastern horizon is moving. And it's pushing those planets upward from our perspective. But this is the heavy climb period of time. It can't see the midheaven yet. It just has to act on faith. And so that's how we get a lot of struggle and faith notions in the 12th house, especially from the ancient authors. The second house, on the other hand, it's underground. And so that's also why I associate it with the garden, is that you're actually tilling the soil in a garden. You're actually getting your hands into it. And this is the level of depth into the ground that the second house tends to speak of, is that which we can actually reach. It's coming up. And quite literally, these are the planets which in our own natal charts, if we had been born, say an hour or two later, would have been rising, but they're not quite yet. They're still under the ground. They're still germinating. And so there's these notions of fertility, I feel, that really come in with the second house. And to me, that helps a lot to conceive of it. I thought that I had gotten this from someone else. Maybe it was like a blog post somewhere when I was going back over all of my different sources and things like that for the sake of this video. I couldn't quite find a straightforward reference to it as the garden. So I don't know if that's like an original coinage or something, but it helps me. So please feel free to utilize that imagery however you will to kind of better get your mind around this house and what it is that we're dealing with. I want to, before we get into the different meanings of the house, just kind of straightforwardly and give it our own treatment from our own perspective, I do want to show the divergence of viewpoints that have developed over history for the second house, because this is one of those houses, I would say perhaps especially the invisible houses from the ascendant which are the houses that are not in a major aspect to the ascendant, I feel that these have perhaps changed and evolved their meanings the most, because by the accounting of ancient astrologers, these were generally considered to be very challenging houses and to rule over aspects of life that are quite difficult. Now, with the second house, that was quite a bit lighter of a shade of gray to be working with, but it definitely still applies in terms of how we can see the changing notions of this house through history. So we'll get into that. But because I've just mentioned it, I want to make reference really quick to the invisible houses, and this is one of them. So the first house aspect many of the other houses in the chart, especially if we conceive of the chart just in terms of whole sign houses. It aspects through a whole sign aspect many of the other houses in the chart, but there are 4 that it does not. So the ascendant aspects the 3rd house and the 11th by sextile. It aspects the 4th and the 10th by square. It aspects the 5th and the 9th by trine, and it aspects the 7th by opposition. And those are the major aspects that we have, the Ptolemaic aspects. Now, in modern astrology, we do have extra aspects that we work with, but these are not the aspects that we're referring to when we're talking about invisible houses. All of this was referenced to by ancient astrologers as essentially inconjunct, which is without aspect. So to a modern mind, we would look at the second house and the 12th as aspected to the first through a semi-sextile, but that was not a consideration originally. And additionally, consider the fact of what the semi-sextile means. It is difficult to see. It's difficult to bridge that gap between the signs that are immediately next to each other. Similarly, with the 6th house and the 8th house, those are configured to the first house by what we would call an inconjunct or a quincunx today. Again, this was not considered to be a significant aspect back in the day. Inconjunct, again, literally means no aspect, but that as well points to a sign that doesn't share any considerations. It doesn't share an element. It doesn't share whether it is, quote, feminine or masculine. Another way of putting that would be passive or active or diurnal or nocturnal. It doesn't share that with it. It does not share the mode of sign. So they won't both be mutable signs. There's a difficulty with seeing and seeing eye to eye. So we still have this notion, and I think that that's really important when we are considering quincunxes and things like this, is that these notions of the actual interpretation of that kind of a relationship or lack thereof remains. We just call it a little bit differently and we look at it a little bit differently. And maybe as we go through the tradition of the second house, we can also see how these notions can change over time and still speak to some of the same things and same themes. But as our culture has changed, and especially since we, as a species, have gotten very into depth psychology, things changed quite a bit as well. And this is also why we tend to look at the ancient tradition, the traditional or medieval tradition, which is a little closer to our own, and then the modern tradition as somewhat separate. So the second house, according to ancient authors, was considered challenging. Manilius refers to it literally as unfortunate and linked it to this notion of Typhon, which is this kind of underworld snake that represents this kind of raw chthonic material power of what is under the soil, what is under the earth. And so by referring to it in that way, he is referring to substance and appetite and survival resources that wind up rising from beneath the surface of life and can sustain life, but can also be destabilizing to basically the goodness of the soul. What's hilarious, I feel, from looking at Manilius and his almost straightforwardly kind of negative view on this house, is this notion of money as the root of all evil. We still have this consideration. We still have this kind of attitude toward the material world. And of course, we don't have to look at it that way. And this still will represent our material considerations. But I just found that incredibly amusing and kind of funny. Now, also, the ancient authors were not all just full on negative about this. Firmicus treated this house in a very pretty thorough way, where he echoed that view, especially due to the fact that it is a passive house. It's not aspecting the ascendant. Again, that's considered a negative by the notion of the ancients, especially in terms of the weakness of the house and the inability of the native with this second house to really control their material fate. We are kind of born into the world that we're born into, and that's going to have a big impact on the quality of our life. And Firmicus actually referred to this house and the eighth as the gates of hell. So each was referred to as gate of hell, but he distinguished between the two. And this is where we're going to get into a fascinating kind of notion, again, about the physical nature of the houses that I think we're going to be talking about for a little while, because we're about to go third house, fourth house, fifth house, sixth house. We're about to do the bottom horizon. We're doing a bunch of houses in a row that are underneath the earth from our perspective. They're not up in the sky. So even though this is a passive house, it's not in aspect to the ascendant, there is another consideration that helps this house quite a bit, which is that it's rising. It's rising up to the ascendant. And that gives it somewhat more strength. As we do get older, we're not just beholden to the resources that our parents are able to provide to us. We can take some control over that. Amusingly, we usually wind up having our ascendant progress into, by day for a year progressions, into the second house, approximately when we start really working up our own resources. So in our prime working years, typically our ascendant is going to be progressed into our second house. This is totally an aside, but it is something that I find quite interesting, that that's usually what we're then focused on, is building up our resources during those years. But back to the gate of hell consideration. So opposite to the second house, we have another house that has to do with materials, the eighth house. But that house is setting. And so even though it is going toward an angle, that is a consideration. It's a succedent house, so it's not quite as bad as quote unquote a cadent house, which is considered to be very, very largely outside of our control. It's going to take a while in a progress chart before we start to enter the cadent houses into the angles, but it is falling. It is going downward toward the earth, and it is about to go into the earth. And what is fascinating is that this notion of the gates of hell, this is a pre-Christian notion of hell, which is just the underworld. And this is, in a large part, what we would consider the domain of Pluto, right? And Pluto being the god of wealth and death. And what do we have in the second house and the eighth? But if we were to boil it down to one word from the ancients passed down to us, would be wealth in the second house and death in the eighth. So that is why this is referred to as the gates of hell. And we can see how that archetype of these succedent houses, which are moving toward the angles, but one is rising and one is falling, really hold in a fascinatingly thorough way. The Greek for this was anaphora, which is rising from the underworld. And then with the eighth house, which again we will discuss in quite a while here, the gate of hell is referred to as epicataphoria, or the fall into the underworld. Now, this notion is also very reflective of a myth of Ishtar's descent. So just quickly, in this myth, Ishtar is required to release or give up all of her possessions before entering hell. And so she has to give things up. She has to release them in the eighth house, is how we could consider that. We must give up everything, including our own body, when we die and when we go under the world. But we are reborn again in the second house. We are released from the underworld. And this is when Ishtar receives her possessions back. So there's this regaining. And so we see again with this archetype, it's really beautiful. And I think it helps so much with understanding more thoroughly the second house and the eighth in particular, this symbolism of loss in the eighth and restoration in the second, or death in the eighth and rebirth in the second. And we can even consider this in the sense of the plants in the garden. They do have to pass at some point. They do have to die, and they release themselves to the earth, and then in the following season, they wind up being reborn again as well out of the soil. So Pluto, Hades, again, god of the dead, also god of wealth. We can see this in these houses. We can see wealth, especially platonic wealth. If we think about the word plutocrat, these are people with an insane amount of money that we cannot conceive because it is born of the natural resources under the earth. It's, the people with gold and gems and things like this, like these big mines, right? This is where that kind of crazy level of wealth can wind up coming from. But in our own lives, again, what is the soil that we till? This is our wealth. It's just dawning on me too. But we can see some level of notions of investment in the 8th house as well. And it's funny to me that the idea then is that we will put some money in, we will release some money to the investment, and we will hope that it will gain on that as the time goes on, and that it will wind up in our 2nd house and bearing fruit, that original investment that we sacrificed in order to hopefully see grow. So we can see, especially just consider life in the ancient world. It was so dependent upon how is the soil? Is it a good season? Is the food growing, right? So getting back to those notions, I think, helps us to understand a bit more the fatalistic aspects to astrology back then. And it can help us to get back to basics without losing, especially all of the potency that we've picked up on in terms of our own knowledge as human beings of the post-psychoanalysis world, right, and worldview. But again, getting back to the basics, we can see that this was considered originally to associate with material life and survival, that which supports the physical body, that which is drawn out of the earth, resources and livelihood that would wind up sustaining existence. And so the emphasis was very practical back then. It wasn't so much psychological, but I do consider the psychological to be important with this. And we'll get into that as well. But this was really centered on how you secure sustenance and how you manage physical and material necessities. Now, by the time we get to the medieval tradition, of course, we're still psychoanalysis in terms of the tradition, but we start to see a real blossoming outward and a bit more hope from the astrologers in terms of this house. Now, Firmicus wasn't fully negative on it. He did consider it to have to do with wealth and things like this, but by the time we get to Alberuni, and then certainly by the time we get to Lilly, we're going to see that there's a much more positive view taken of this house than was previously the case. So Alberuni expands this to mean like nutriment and livelihood, even assistance. By the time we get to Lilly, now we're speaking of matters of estate and substance, wealth and poverty. He speaks of it as especially movable goods. So I'm a little on the fence about this. I do consider property investments to be significant to the 2nd, but what I usually look for in that case is going to be some relationship or some confirmation from the 4th house as well. And that's part of the reason why Lilly is holding off on property. And it's at this point that the 2nd house also starts to become associated with Taurus. Lilly is where a lot of that comes from, and is part of the reason as well why I don't just completely sweep aside the fact that there are some significant overlaps between the signs and the houses if we were to associate Aries with the 1st and Taurus with the 2nd, etc. I think that we extremely over-rely upon those notions of this is referred to as like the alphabet astrology, where it's like Aries 1st house, Taurus 2nd house, Gemini 3rd house. The problem with that is that it oversimplifies to some extent, but it also conflates. And so the 2nd house can start picking up notions from Taurus, and Taurus can start picking up notions from the 2nd house, and it gets a little bit muddy. But Lilly does consider Taurus to be a co-significator as well as Jupiter. Now, I don't really associate Jupiter with this house. I love to see Jupiter in this house because that is very nice and helpful for material circumstances. And it is worth noting that according to the planetary joys, there is no planet that takes its joy in this house. So by my consideration, There is no planet that's associated with this, but feel free to take Jupiter on some level as a co-significator here. Finally, I also want to clarify in terms of mundane astrology, the second house, for instance, of a nation, a national chart. This tends to speak to the nation's assets, the treasury, the revenue, banks, especially central banks. And we can see the food supply and crops, things like this, some aspects of trade and exports as well. But I do tend to look at monetary policy in particular, budgets and things like this, as more of an eighth house notion, because that has to do with spending. So that is important to keep in mind, that not every financial consideration of a nation is going to be in the second house. And also in our own lives, not every financial consideration is going to be primarily a second house thing. We will see some attitudes around spending in the second house, but we also do want to look at eighth house for money that's going outward. Now, finally, I also want to point out the notion of triads, house triads. We're going to talk about this also as we go through all of the houses. And you'll hear me sometimes in the horoscopes refer to things like this, where to me, there is a substantial relationship between the second house, the sixth house, and the 10th house. I refer to these as earthy houses. This is a modern astrology kind of way of looking at that. If we were to take some alphabet astrology, these would be the houses that would overlap with Taurus, Virgo, and Capricorn, if we were looking at it just from a sign basis. But beyond that, these are all public success and resource and effort related houses. So a lot of this, if we have a traditional career, we're going to look at different aspects of what that career means to us in these three houses in particular. So the second house being our income from our career, the sixth house being the day-to-day effort that we put into it and what that looks like. And then the 10th house being what is our role, what is our position, and what is the flavor of our career, generally speaking, like from a broader perspective, right? So that to me is also very important to keep in mind. I also want to point this out. This is a succedent house. So not only is there that triad, but there's also this set of 4 houses which come right before each of the angles in terms of how the chart moves through the day. So the second house, it is rising up to the angle of the ascendant. The 11th house is also succedent. It's rising up toward the midheaven, hence why it's a good house. It's rising up toward a really excellent angle. The 8th house is succedent because it is falling toward the angle of the descendant. And the 5th house is succedent and it is falling toward the imum coeli. Basically, all of these houses have to do with resources and support in one way or another. Underneath the horizon is a bit more personal for us. It's a bit closer to home. Quite literally, it's closer to the imum coeli, right? So the 5th house, this is our children. Our children support and represent resources of our family. So the 5th house represents the resources relative to the 4th house, the imum coeli, the family, right? Similarly, we see the resources of the partner in the 8th house, which is going toward the partner. It's going toward the descendant. So it's supportive of that descendant, represents the support and resources back and forth there. The 11th house is the resources and the support, which is associated with the public career. So this is why we tend to see social groups and colleagues and people like this, as well as our aspirations. So what are the resources that are social in terms of our social aspirations that are supportive of and support our climb toward the midheaven? Well, with the second house, these are the supports and the resources that we have. It's climbing toward the ascendant. So it is our resources and our support, quite literally. We have a lot to do with that. So these are some of the kind of definitional, overarching notions that we want to keep in mind with the second house. And I know that was kind of a very long intro, but I wanted to really lay a lot of the foundation here before we start to go into how to interpret the second house. So with all of that said, let's kick it off in terms of how to interpret this. There's a lot of overlap between these different notions that I'm going to offer, but I think it's really worth keeping all of them in mind so that we're not really leaving out large chunks of what the second house can provide to us in terms of meaning within our charts. So firstly, the second house is our wealth and it is our livelihood. It's how we earn our income. It is the nature of our income. It is the amount of our income, our investments. We can even see part of our inheritance here after it has become our own. And we can also see our possessions here. So with the second house describing what we possess or hope to possess more deeply, the resources and capacities that give us a sense of worth and safety and security, especially that was once provided to us. And this is a great way to look at it, of like identification with the mother. What did the parent used to offer to us and provide to us in terms of support and resources? A lot of that being money and well-being and food and a roof over our head. And so they were providing that. And then we need to provide that for ourselves again, keeping in mind this is typically the sign, the house that's rising in our charts when we are at prime working age. So for most people, this is going to translate quite literally into money. But our wealth goes beyond that into, again, this notion of livelihood. Wealth isn't just the money that we have in the bank account, but even if money is the major motivator, one of the best ways for that to play out is to have that desire for money become a spur for our own personal development and motivation to cultivate our own wealth. So our talents, our own internal resources, our own internal skills that might otherwise not have been developed or might not have been pursued, maybe because it's not the most fun thing, but it is helpful in terms of contribution to society, of getting the work done, right? And there needing to be a motivating factor there. So we're going to discuss that a little bit more later, but in terms of the innate faculties, the earning potential, as well as how we go about making a living is all seen here. So do we tend to bring that in very easily, or do we tend to create our livelihood or our financial wealth through a lot of effort? We can see that in this house. For one example, we could potentially see Taurus in this house having some sense of putting in good, clean effort, but there being an ease to it and not necessarily feeling the need to double or triple down or value the effort in and of itself. If we had Capricorn here, Capricorn may actually value the wealth of contribution to such an extent that it may feel guilty about receiving resources that it didn't work hard for, So there may even be a little bit more of a hesitancy to receive by Capricorn, right? In particular, because it's ruled by Saturn as opposed to Venus, right? So that flavors our attitude toward our wealth and our livelihood, even just by the sign that is in this house. But even the style of our wealth, we could see. Maybe if we are an investor into like products, right? If we are basically, I guess that would be like a merchant, we may hold a lot of our wealth in objects that are due to be sold, right? But if we are trading in goods, we can see some notion of that. For one thing, there's probably going to be several planets in this place. In that case, we might see like Mercury and Venus or something like this, Saturn, Jupiter, showing that there are multiple stores of wealth and that it's coming through in multiple different ways. Or we may see a lot of planets surrounding the ruler of this house in some other part of our chart as well. So how we go about making a living, what is the style, what is the nature of our wealth and our stores of wealth? For the most part, under this phase of capitalism, a lot of us, quote unquote, store our wealth in our skills and in the value that we bring to companies and corporations, right? So we have a skill that is valuable to a corporation, and we tend to save some of our wealth in like a retirement account, but otherwise we tend to bring the wealth in and then we tend to spend that wealth out on a somewhat regular basis, on mortgages, on car loan payments, things like this, and, on food, etc. So we tend to be reproducing ourselves and our lives and livelihoods with our income, typically. But for instance, we would also expect then to see a major transit with regard to our wealth and our livelihood to this house or to the ruler of this house, if there's going to be a major shift or a major change in the style or in the attitude or in the effort or the rhythm of creating our sense of wealth. Also, keeping in mind the assets that we bring to the table and the fact that that is our wealth. I forget exact quotes, but there's something about like knowledge, like a wealth of knowledge, right? That also applies here. So our natural skills, talents, assets that we bring to the table. Now, also, what is our relationship with all of this? Do we tend to cling tightly to our wealth and livelihood? This is going to ping notions of safety and security that we're about to talk to as well, and our psychological orientation towards these things. But again, for instance, if we have Capricorn in this house, there's probably going to be a desire to save and to see that the numbers are good, Or again, Capricorn may store their wealth in the things that they hold on to. So there is a tendency to want to hold on to things with Capricorn. If Sagittarius were here, there would probably be a bit more of an attitude of easy come, easy go. I'm going to bring it in. I'm going to spend it. I'm going to enjoy it. Life is an adventure. Money is not something that we can take with us in our life, so we may as well enjoy it while we're here, and who knows how long that's going to be for, kind of an attitude, right? We may even see that with Jupiter in this place, as this kind of attitude of easy come, easy go, depending on the sign that's there. But the ease with which Jupiter is able to bring in or attract resources may encourage that kind of an attitude of, well, I'm just going to spend it because there's more coming anyway. Now, we would want to pay attention to our transits if we had that attitude towards things. That might not always be the case, but we can definitely see those attitudes and how they play out and where they're coming from. Additionally, how much do we value something after we've earned it is, I think, another way of looking at how it is that we spend. That we're going to get into a bit more when we're speaking about how value comes in here, but that is also something to keep in mind. This also points out what types of possessions we will own or that will support us. So what is it that supports us? What is it that we own? What are our resources? That is what shows up in this house. So if someone owns real estate, and that is really significant to their life, there's probably going to be some aspect of the moon that's coming in here. Maybe there's going to be Cancer in that house, which is going to make the moon the ruler of that house. Maybe the moon is in the second house, or maybe the moon is in a very strong relationship with the ruler of this house. And again, by transit to that moon or by transit to this house, we should then be able to see perhaps when someone comes into possession of real estate. Additionally, how much do we value income? We want to then kind of look at this in relationship to the rest of the triad, the 10th house and the 6th house as well, and perhaps some of the relationships between the rulers of these houses, but also, again, the planets that are in these houses. If we have a loaded up 10th house and an empty second house, and the ruler of the second house is not the most aspected planet in our chart, etc., we may find that money is not the biggest motivator for us in terms of our effort, but rather wanting to make our mark on the world is much more important to us than holding on to resources or developing resources. It may still help to provide us with a lot of resources, but what we're then much more focused on is not so much how are we supported and what are our resources, but then we're probably focused on building up the resources of our kind of public-facing image and the impact that has. And we may even wind up diverting a lot of our personal resources into supporting that climb, basically. Another way we might see that is the second house ruler in the 11th, for instance, or the second house ruler in the 10th, where a lot of the finance that comes in some way or another, winds up getting reinvested back into the career and back into the climb. So maybe this is going for certification after certification. Maybe this is going to grad school. Maybe this is personally financing through our work, through our effort, maybe on something that isn't independent, our ability to eventually go independent and make our mark as with our own name. So freelancing, entrepreneurship, we can see that with the second house as well. But we may see, for instance, entrepreneurship or freelancing as maybe we have a fire sign in the second house, and independence of our work, or Aquarius or something like this, where independence is very important to us when it comes to our wealth and our livelihood. We may want for that to not depend on our value to a company or a corporation or something like that. And that may be a primary consideration for us. But in that case, we're likely to see that here, right? So that is something that we would want to look for if we're looking for freelancing, or again, being an entrepreneur or working independently. Things like this are likely to show up here. Uranus here could even show a lot of those different aspects of earning potential. It also strongly reflects our desire and the import that we place upon self-reliance. So supporting ourselves in our own right, and the sense of self-worth that is derived from our financial position. So if there's a lot of planets in the 8th, but there are none in the 2nd, or again, if the ruler of the 8th is much better positioned or much more prominently positioned than the ruler of the 2nd, we may see ourselves somewhat comfortable with depending upon others. We may genuinely want to build a life with someone else, and being able to take care of ourselves may just not be something that is extremely important to us. We could even see that by the 8th house ruler being in the 2nd house, for instance, as something that we deeply value is building and sharing our wealth with others. So ultimately here, the 2nd house is offering a lot of insight into our earning power, the way that we manage our money and our resources, and which activities and which skills of ours may become very lucrative to us. So this is one of the ways of, if we're looking at our chart and we're wondering, how can I best build wealth? We want to pay close attention to what's going on in that 2nd house, or where that 2nd house ruler is otherwise in the chart, because it's going to indicate to us where we can expect to see gain, or where we can expect to see an increase of material possessions, how we can tap into creating more of what we can call our own, or what is ours, how we can bring ourselves more comfort. Now, all of this is to basically be a boon to our personal resources. So quite literally, what is ours then? How we utilize and develop these things. So we can also see the nature of our resources here. Are they, strictly speaking, material? Is that the orientation toward our resources? Is that even the notion that first comes to mind when we are conceiving of what our resources are? That's a pretty solid clue as to what's going on in that 2nd house. But what is the nature of our resources on a mental level and on a spiritual level? What is it that we call our own? What do we have? What is mine? There's a lot of different aspects of myself that is mine, So what is it that supports us and serves our needs? The 2nd house tends to be quite a bit about self-reliance, but we can do that in all different kinds of ways. And this is also the area where we can see how it is that we take care of ourselves, how we take care of our possessions, how we take care of our lives and our experiences. So how do we develop those resources, and how do we take care of them? Also, what do we spend on, and how do we spend? Are we bargain hunters, or do we look for quality first and longevity of our resources first? Maybe there's a mix there. Do we tend to spend somewhat rashly, or do we take a lot of time making sure that a purchase is going to be as valuable as what we are giving up for it, right? So our relationship to value and ownership is very important here as well when it comes to what our personal resources are. If we value beauty, for instance, if Venus is here, especially like if Venus in Libra is here or something like this, there may be a good amount of spending on high-end beauty products, things like this, high-end clothing. If Venus in Taurus is here, then this may be a little bit more oriented toward comfort and security and stability. So creating a comfortable environment, spending on the home, spending on the sense of sanctuary that the home provides. And there may still be a solid sense of like spending on wellness products and things like that, but it may be a bit more oriented toward organics and things like this. Mercury may be here if we tend to spend quite a bit on technologies. With Uranus or Neptune here, we're likely to see some quirky, interesting resources that we have put our income or our wealth into. Neptune may spend quite a bit on developing spiritual resources, as in giving to charity. That is very heartening. Altruism is a resource then that makes oneself feel secure and safe and supported. That being good to others is being good to the universe and therefore oneself as well. So giving up what one doesn't need. Uranus could have some very interesting hobby or collection or something like this that's very unique. So this governs personal resources, again, on every level. Additionally, I want to reinforce the notion of attitudes. So I think that this is a resource that a lot of people can overlook. But for instance, someone working in customer service of any sort or human relations of any sort, that is a very important personal resource to have. So are you able to handle other people well? What is your attitude toward life? Someone who is very optimistic, for instance, if Sagittarius is in this place and the person is quite optimistic, if they have like a well-placed Jupiter, their optimism is likely to be lucrative to them. Now, it may not be the thing that they do that is nominally what or ostensibly what they're getting their paycheck for, but they could potentially, through their optimism, reach for opportunities that other people might not reach for. They may ask for things that other people might be shy to ask for. They may put themselves in positions that are kind of risky, but with a big payoff that winds up paying off for them. They may just have good timing and good luck with things. And these are personal resources that we can rely upon. So I want to kind of emphasize here, we should be going pretty abstract with this. We should be really not just narrowing in on, oh, if I have Jupiter in my second house, I'm going to make money from being a lawyer or something like this. It may be through a really good attitude and a lot of optimism and a lot of integrity, basically, and orderliness and a bit of predictability combined with an attitude of favoring growth, right? So reaching for things, but in an orderly fashion with Jupiter there. Even the body itself is obviously a resource that we need in our lives, and that can also show up in some aspects here. So do we have a strong body? Is that something that we utilize for our work, right? So an NFL athlete would probably have some notion of getting a lot of finance from having an extremely, extremely strong body, right? And we should be able to see that here. But just as there's a wealth of knowledge, there's also this notion of health is wealth as well. And so the body, the attitudes, which has psychological underpinnings to it as well, the skills, all of this should be seen here. And the way that it impacts the amount of support and resources that we are able to develop for ourselves. But this also brings up issues of management. How do we manage these resources? Not only money, but our powers, basically. Do we try to grow our resources? Do we try to develop new skills? Do we spend time thinking about where our self-worth is derived from as a resource as well? Do we spend time thinking about where we attach our self-esteem beyond our earning capacity as well? And so even though we do see notions of shopping and ownership and accumulation as expressions of the second house, hopefully we are also questioning this house to some extent, again, on a more abstract level of asking ourselves what's actually useful to us, what actually makes us feel safe and secure. A hyperfixation on material goods and considerations, this can turn easily into greed, and then there's never enough. And the safety and security is kind of never found. And part of the reason for that is that we're then not really looking at the second house as what can't be taken from us. So what is our own? What is mine, but can't be taken away? So I also tend to look at the second house as having a lot to do with our notions of attachment to things. And archetypally, then we can also get into notions of like samsara and getting stuck in samsara due to attachments. And especially in in that sense to material things and control over things. This is mine. This is something outside of me that I'm identifying with. That is 100% something that we see in the second house, but there are also pitfalls to that. And we see that repeatedly throughout, all of these notions of Ishtar, always having to give up all the possessions. We always have to give up our bodies at the end of our lives. And we can never truly own or control something that is outside of us. And that then pinging into the eighth house again. This is part of the reason why whenever I see that axis and I'm speaking to them in the horoscopes, I tend to bring up these notions of, hey, we can only control ourselves. That's all that we truly have to control. We can't control how other people are going to handle things. And so notions of trust of other people should really be rooted in a trust of ourselves to do the right thing in any given situation that someone else may present to us, So looking at the second house in the sense of our personal resources also as our personal strength, our resilience, our ability to rely on ourselves, the resources that we have at our disposal in order to turn into the physical resources that we need to sustain ourselves as well. So again, the skills that we can trade literally for, the money that we can spend on food and so forth, the characteristics, the good attitude that can get us a promotion over someone else, the circumstances that we're born into that can also help to provide for us and can help us to understand better financial considerations, financial planning, etc. Our attitudes and tendencies, maybe we tend to save for a rainy day so that we're always going to have in a physical sense what we need. But all of this is a resource, a very important resource, and will show itself in the second house. So now that we are getting well into psychological themes here, let's go full on into that and speak of notions of safety and security. This was implicit in the way that the ancients looked at this house. But safety and security were kind of looked at in a more literal sense of how much do you have. And there wasn't as much delving back then into notions of subconscious fears and subconscious attachments and things like this that may not be actually reflected in our circumstances, but may still have some level of impact on our circumstances. So what is our perspective on safety and security? Do we feel secure or do we not? And what has an impact on our sense and our feeling of being safe and secure or insecure? Again, a lot of this has to do with attachments and our anxieties about attachments. And we do, because again of the notion of this being a house of things that are provided for by parents prior to them being provided by us, certainly these tendencies tend to arise in the childhood. And if there were survival questions or fears or anxieties that were engendered around survival and well-being when we're young, then this can be seen here as perhaps something of a continual thorn in our side that we're going to want to look at, that we're going to want to uproot, right? We're going to want to think about that and see if there's a different way that maybe we can express some of the challenges that we may see in the second house. So if we can see Cancer in this house, then safety and security, of course, there's a repeated theme there. It's going to be really important. That's going to be the case for Gemini rising. If the moon is here, that's also going to be really important. If Saturn is here, it may have us feel that there is always some sense of scarcity. If Mars is here, we may reflect our safety and security in taking action or spending or trying to earn, pushing ourselves to earn more. If Jupiter is here, of course, we're going to see that safety and security is something that's important, but the attitude toward it may be one of a bit more ease and confidence. If Venus is here, that will help a lot with attracting the resources that one needs, and that's also going to probably engender a greater sense of safety and security as innate and something that doesn't need to be fretted about quite as much as some other placements. You know, Neptune here may feel like, yeah, the resources come in, but I don't understand why there always seem to be these things that come up and those resources wind up dissolving seemingly into thin air, you know. But the thing is that I definitely personally believe when it comes to astrology that we can identify the complications along these lines by looking at our charts and trying to address those things and just taking account of them and then trying to express those placements or those indications somewhat differently. So a lot of that can come from a theme that I tend to preach about a lot with this house is self-trust. So that, to me, underpins true self-reliance. There is this process of individuation that's important not only in the first house, but also in the second house, of discovering what it is that makes us feel safe and grounded, not just what other people do. There are tons of people with really big bank account balances because that's what they think that they need to do, but they still don't feel safe and secure. So different things represent security to different people. Again, like I mentioned with Gemini here, for instance, in the second, knowledge may feel like a sense of safety and security, and not knowing what's going on with something may make you feel very anxious and very insecure. Mercury may similarly show up in that way. If Saturn is here, wanting to feel that there is stability and a really solid ground and that there's control in this place is probably what's going to make someone feel safe and secure. If Venus is here, having solid relations with those around you, knowing that you can mutually rely upon other people. With the moon here, it may be connections to family, making one feel safe and secure. But whatever it is that gives us a sense of safety and security, we tend to be very highly motivated to acquire those things and to protect those things. So these are definitely like high priority things that we have growing in our garden, especially I don't know if I want to say especially if we are conscious about where our insecurities lie or if we're conscious about our second house indications. I think we tend to do this subconsciously anyway, but being very aware of what brings us a sense of safety and security, it can show us, it can reaffirm to us that we really value ourselves and our well-being and our feelings by prioritizing that for ourselves. I read this notion recently. I think this was Howard Sasportas, who was talking about how the second house can show how the ego extends itself beyond the self, beyond the body, attaching itself to external things or unconsciously treating things that are outside of the self as a part of the self. And that when those attachments feel safe, that we feel secure. But when they're threatened, then we feel kind of destabilized. We feel anxious about these things. And that's another thing that I would kind of throw out there with this house is the danger of attachment on that level as well. If we value our relationships foremost, and those are going through some difficulty, that can make us feel deeply insecure on a level that isn't entirely necessary. Keeping in mind that safety can turn into insecurity if something isn't quite going as well, if something specific isn't quite going as well in our lives as we might like. And so that is something to keep in mind of a way of taking care of ourselves. If you have Venus in this house and you're feeling kind of lonely, check in, try and make sure that there's not a sense of scarcity mindset that may be spinning out from that one sense of lack and that one sense of over-attachment of your sense of security to the relationships that you have around you, you know. Again, with the connection to childhood of the second house, any sort of childhood fears are also likely to get stirred up by a sense of insecurity here. So fears around not being provided for. And what else is interesting is how often we can see that losses, for instance, of income, can have us redefine our notions of what we truly value. It opens up an opportunity to come back to what we really need, what actually offers us a sense of support and well-being and the resources that we need. And so it can wind up basically engendering through some of those experiences a shift and change in our notions of ourselves and self-trust and things like this as well. Any sort of crises along these lines. Additionally, where at times could this become a bit of a prison for us as well? I think that's another thing we tend to do as, you know, modern people who have on some level a lot of options, but also need to feed ourselves and the complications of that in our society currently. But if we over-attach ourselves to security, for instance, maybe we have, again, Saturn here, or maybe we have Pluto here, we can kind of lock ourselves into a sense of stagnation by trying to control, by trying to assert some power or authority over our security in a bit of a heavy-handed kind of a way. And in that sense, we may actually find that our possessions Or again, the bank account balance can be something of a prison. There's this notion that I tend to like from minimalists about what you own owns you. I don't know exactly, I don't remember where that comes from, but I tend to try and keep that in mind, that the more things that we have, the more we have to do. The more things that we have, the more things we have to spend time cleaning and keeping in good working order, etc. The more things that we need to manage. We need to manage all of our possessions. And that does take some energetic resources. So thinking in a very serious way about your garden. What do you want to have in there? Because you're going to be working on all of it. You're going to be tilling all of that soil. So what do we want to be growing in there? I think even looking at the second house in and of itself can be this weird kind of encouragement toward minimalism, because just as much as we can create a sense of freedom for ourselves here, and just as much as Sagittarius here, or maybe Jupiter or Uranus here kind of would, and that would be a major priority of it, we can find freedom through having what we need. But again, if we over-identify with those things, with possessions, if we over-attach ourselves to too many things outside of ourselves, it can really become a prison. So something to keep in mind, to these notions of freedom and limitation. So finally, loosening up the material aspect of this kind of to the max. The second house to me is a lot about what we value and how we relate to what we value. A lot of modern astrologers speak to the second house as being our values. So like in the sense of our convictions. And that is one thing that we may see here, but we could see that in so many different parts of the chart as well. I mean, the planets that are rising, that's also going to be really important to us. That which we hold on high up toward the midheaven is going to be really important to us. That which is clustered around the Imam Kuli is also going to be super important to us. So we can see our values in many, many, many different places, but we are going to value whatever shows up here. Do we even really highly value safety and security? I mean, on a human level, vast majority of us, are probably going to do that. But again, Uranus here could get very quirky, and Neptune here could get quite quirky as well and say, you know what, safety, security, it's kind of overrated. Life is to be lived, and I'll be fine. And what I really value is having this wealth of unique experience in my life. And that's what I value much more so. And so being willing to make the sacrifice of feeling safe and secure for the sense of maybe adventure or experience or something like this. So the values, they can be quantitative. Sometimes we like having a really good savings. Sometimes we have a specific number that we like to see somewhere. Sometimes we like having a car that is, less than 5 years old or whatever it is. Sometimes we really want to have that second home. We want to have, good investments or whatever it is. But just as much as it is that quantitative, it's also qualitative for virtually all of us, especially if we are remotely in touch with ourselves. What do we appreciate? What do we desire? What do we like? These are all very strong notions of what is it that we value and what is the attitude that we take toward the things that we value. So what do we want more of? We're probably going to see that. That's kind of I think, on some levels, one of the easier questions for us to answer for ourselves along all of these lines. What do we want more of in our lives? We're probably going to see some notion of that in the second house. Again, looking at the sign there, looking at the planets there, looking at its ruler and the relationships that its ruler is creating for us. Like I said, if Venus is here, there's going to be a value of relationships. And if those seem fraught and few, or even there's a total lack of a sense of connection with others, that is something that native with Venus there is going to want more of. And to lack that is going to stir up some definite insecurities. Also, what do we value in terms of our lifestyles, our taste? What do we like? What do we appreciate? What kinds of art do we appreciate? Yes, we'll see this in like the fifth house and other places as well, but our sense of taste is going to be impacted by what is it that we value. If we value complexity and intricacy, maybe we see Scorpio here, as opposed to if Aquarius is here, we may really value technical skill and precision. So that may have an impact on our taste in art, especially if we value art quite a bit, if that's something that's important to one's lifestyle. But look at the second house in terms of your lifestyle. What is it that you have created more of in your life? What are your decor preferences, basically? Do you like to have a simple life? Do you like to have a luxurious life? Do you like to have a comfy life? Do you want to be surrounded by family? Do you want to be in a big city? Do you want to live in the countryside? Again, yes, these are things that we can see in other parts of the chart as well. But I think that a lot of that really stems from what do we ultimately value. And so I think we can see a lot of that with the second house as well. So we're much more likely to draw in to our sense of experience what we see in this house. And we may even see major changes in values and things like that. Again, as we get transits here, like I'm sure that for Pisces rising, I've been talking to you guys in the horoscopes about how probably your sense of what you value is up for a shift toward the immaterial. There may be, again, these notions of not wanting to be tied down or wanting to be limited by possessions, things like this. So also paying attention to how are the transits going to play out over the course of your life, especially the long-term transits where we can kind of see, okay, they're going to be here and there in like 20 years. We can look for that and time that out and see, okay, there was a big change in my values when that outer planet wound up transiting through that house. Especially if you have any planets there, then those conjunctions are going to be very important in shifting how you value things or your notions of safety and security. Finally, with regard to lifestyle and value, again, this kind of comes back to a sense of attachment or identification. This to me pings the 11th house a little bit too. I also will speak to lifestyle when it comes to the 11th house because, again, that is the social aspirations. How do you want to be seen? But where that runs deep, I feel, is also in the second house. So again, these notions of what do you see outside of yourself as a part of yourself? What do you react to and feel kind of like that is me out there in the world? We can think of that in terms of scenes. If you've run in a specific scene, let's say you identify as, being part of the hippie generation and being a hippie and identifying with that scene for your life. Probably when you see the trappings of that outside of yourself, you may see a part of yourself in that, and that is a value assessment. That is something that you value that is related to your lifestyle. It's related to your tastes. It's something you identify with. So I hope that makes sense. But again, this is that notion of kind of extending our ego over these things that are outside of us that we value and that we identify strongly with. And there may be many things along these lines as well. How many planets are in this house? How many things do we identify with in a very kind of almost visceral way in that sense? So, I mean, in a literal sense, this is speaking to what does money really mean to us? What do possessions really mean to us? But also then questions of what do our skills really mean to us? And what does our family really mean to us? What does social connection really mean to us? And how do we behave toward that which we value? Are we a bit heavier-handed with the people that we value in our lives versus the people that we don't? Now, some of this is cultural, certainly, coming from New York. I can certainly say that insult is directly proportional to closeness, But do we take good care of the things that we like? How do we treat those things? Also, in a fascinating way, is the first house ruler in this house, or is this second house, is its ruler in the first? Do we value ourselves? And how much, and how do we show that? And what is it about ourselves that we value? We're likely to see that in whatever the planet is that's ruling that, and the house, the signs that show up on those cusps. So what is it that you value about yourself? And all of this is flowing into this notion of the garden that we're tending. What are we cultivating more of in our own lives? What are we putting our energy into, hoping to see some outcome or some result from that? So what do we nurture? What do we grow? What do we take pride in? And how do we develop a sense of self through this, through recognizing what's important to us, by recognizing what we're attached to? And then how is it that we assure those things, that we assure that we keep those attachments close to us, because that is human nature, as, attached people who have not reached a level of nirvana, right? How do we secure the type of sustenance that is most important to us? How do we secure those relationships if we have Venus here? If it's Venus in Libra, it's probably going to be by giving a lot, by being really considerate, by trying to balance things, by trying to compromise. If that Venus is in Aries, it might be a little bit more fraught. Now we have a planet that we're trying to please, but it's in an environment that can be complicated. So we may value relationships with people who are very bold and very dramatic and may make some rash decisions. And we may ourselves make some rash decisions about how we treat people in a given moment. And so again, we may have a bit more fraught of relationships, even though we value them no less. But how do we treat them? How do we take care of them? How do we till that soil? And is it in a way that is going to affirm or ensure that that attachment remains close? These are, I think, really important questions when it comes to the second house. Everything that's in this house is definitely in a very fertile environment for that self-development, for developing those identifications, for getting to know ourselves better through the things that we attach to, through the comforts that we're able to create for ourselves. And so it is very life-affirming. And again, think about the support and the resources of the succedent houses. This is life-affirming to our own life, to our own notion of self. This is where we assure ourselves, where we create comfort for ourselves. And hopefully, again, this may just be me, but I think a lot of this has to come through a sense of self-trust. If we don't have that, it's very difficult, I think, to really grow big roots here. So with this as the soil that we till, the place of cultivation, of fertility, livelihood, lifestyle, comfort, this being the release from the underworld, this is where we get all our things back from being in the underworld. These are the adornments. These are the things that we keep close and that we identify as our possessions, our own things. And again, on the notion of lifestyle, like we often fantasize about what we could become if only we had more resources. So again, our tastes and our possessions help define us. Even if we don't have those things, it still supports that notion of that which we are identified with. What is our lifestyle? What is that scene that we belong to, even if we don't have all of the trappings of it? But if we do identify strongly in that sense with the lifestyle, we are likely to try to bring those things closer to us, to affirm that for ourselves, to affirm that aspect of ourself as true, right? So our tastes and possessions do help to define us, and this house shows what kinds of objects, what kinds of environments, what kinds of connections make us feel most ourselves. So we see here what reflects our sense of self, supports our self-value, and can be genuinely self-sustaining as long as we, again, remember that we're more than what we own. We're more than what we have already grown. But we should be a big part of what we value. And if we are, then I think we're starting from a much better place with the second house in terms of our ability to produce really good and comfortable and secure lives for ourselves. I really feel like if we don't have self-trust and self-value, it doesn't matter what we collect. We're not going to feel safe and secure. And so, when it comes to the support of the first house, I think that's, again, a really strong notion that we should be developing in this place and that we should be looking for in all of the indications around this house. But finally, there's one more notion of the garden that I want to point out here or reiterate, because I think it's going to help with some of the notion of the skills and talents and attitudes aspect. Not to mention, how we develop our actual skills that we monetize, right? The garden is a place where we can take something, a seed, and we can plant it and we can grow it into something which is inherently more valuable. Not only is it more valuable, but in many cases, it also offers a sense of even more growth, of producing seeds in fruit as well. So the skills that we have can be built upon repeatedly, but we can also take something that we might perceive of as very small or not of the greatest notion of value for ourselves and turn it into something incredibly valuable in the second house. So combining the skills that we have developed through the years, through going to school, elementary school and or primary school and middle school and high school, college, maybe graduate school, whatever, we've taken something very small, a little baby, and we've taught it a lot of things. So we have been tilling the heck out of that soil of the mind and the skill set for a very long time. And it's very, very fertile, very, very rich. We can continue to add to that if we want, but we've also created something that is lucrative just by, planting those seeds of education. If we then also combine that with trying to teach that baby good social skills and consideration and care of others, then we're enriching all of those different things. We can think of these as different kinds of nutrients that we're feeding this. We're going to get better and better and better results depending on the quality of the inputs and hopefully barring any sort of major lack of inputs. But even if there were a lack of inputs in our early childhood, for instance, maybe we weren't taught self-esteem or self-value. Maybe there was an educational challenge that wasn't properly tended to. Maybe there was a subject that one struggled with, and maybe that even undermined the self-esteem to some extent. But maybe it's something that one still values quite a bit, and we can learn these things. We can kind of reparent through the gardening process as well, till our own soil even as we get older, and possibly even do it better than would have been done originally anyway. So keeping in mind that we can take something of quote unquote like little value and turn it into something valuable here at any point in time. As long as there's potential, as long as there's that seed, you can plant this here, put some time, some effort, and some care into it, and you're going to get something valuable out of it. So with that said, I have some example charts that I want to run through. A couple of these are like the standard ones. Karl Marx is a really great second house. Warren Buffett is a good second house. I'm also going to use Martha Stewart, and then I have kind of a fun little example of Johnny PayCheck, a country singer. But starting with Karl Marx, for him, of course, he is the major foundational author around notions of communism, wrote an insane amount of books, and was a really prolific philosopher, focusing really strongly on quote unquote political economy, the way that the financial systems and the economic incentives are structured within society in a very exploitative way, et cetera. Strong focus on labor, He is clearly very, very, very critical of the way that money is handled and looks at money and finances and possessions and investments and all of this with an extremely, extremely critical eye, and believes very strongly in so much more material equality than he's seeing, and compassion, and is disgusted to see financial exploitation, economic exploitation, etc., and rails against this fervently and with a very, very sharp tongue very often. And what does he have in his second house but Pisces, right? So he's very invested. He very much values material resources and the life-affirming aspects of that, right? The quality of life that one is able to have through having their material needs met. And he wants to have that for whom? For Pisces, which is everyone. He wants that to be universal. People shouldn't really be left behind by his notions at all. But the way that he's also going about that is Saturn and Pluto, which is by an extremely stinging rebuke of the entire system, the entire notion of control and economic power and exploitation. Again, this is a Saturn and a Pluto that are in Pisces, so they are inclined toward a universalization. This isn't inclined toward a grabbing for himself kind of a thing. And so he looks at the class system around him that everyone is a part of, and he sees how it is hurting everyone, including, the capitalist classes, etc., and separating people and harming people. So he sees the material harm that can be done as well through a lack, Saturn and Pluto, of material resources. We have a further kind of universalization, non-materialism notion a bit with that Jupiter, the ruler of this house, by traditional rulership schema. Jupiter rules Pisces, and so that is up in the whole sign 12th house as well. It is in Capricorn, so again, it is focusing very much on society These are worldly signs here, pretty much from Sag all the way to Pisces. This is the outer world. This is society. This is fundamentally impersonal in terms of the signs. So they will make these big structured critiques. These are the signs of the philosophers and the people who run society, so systems thinking basically across the board here. That Jupiter, that second house, looking at it from that worldly, mundane perspective, but also again in the 12th house where it's more transcendent. Everyone should have what they need. That is a fundamental value of his across the board. But that is again that's a fallen Jupiter. That is he's frustrated about it, and he will critique it, and he will put a lot of effort into building an influence that has stuck around to influence this collective unconscious basically, that he was, as what I would consider a world historical figure, he has tapped into, and that he has expressed in a way that people have held on to for a very, very, very long time. His critiques, and his notions of the solutions as well, with Jupiter and Capricorn there, which will look for structural solutions, one of which is looking at the world in terms of historical materialism, is literally, that's what his notion of what we call communism is actually referred to as, also the labor theory of value. So what is the effort that is put in? What is the labor that has created the value that is being then held and controlled and, extracted from the labor that people put into things and not properly compensated. So he has an extremely critical eye, but also these huge ideals that are going into this. Now, aside from all of that, he also struggled financially for basically his whole life. Believe it or not, this was not a lucrative career for him. He tended to rely quite strongly on his partner, Friedrich Engels, for financial support. And so we do see Saturn, the malefic, in that second house doing the normal thing of being complicated for him, Now, he probably also felt deeply, deeply, deeply insecure in a lot of different ways. The ruler of that house in the 12th also points to that there's a challenge there when it comes to his ability to earn, but all of this is reflected in his values. And by that, I do mean his convictions. He could have made a huge amount of money as a philosopher and economist, but he did not want to go the normal way. He did not believe what he was being told about the economy, and he felt the need, he felt it was more valuable and more important, more significant for him to make a huge mark on society, like I was saying, planets around the midheaven, making his mark about his ideas with that Uranus-Neptune conjunction there, up near the midheaven. His ideals are up toward the midheaven. He actually has two somewhat negating planets in his second house. It's more important for him that he made a mark than that he made money. So we can see just so much in this chart about his financial life, his values, and how he lived that out, and also how he impacted the world through his attitudes from this house. There's a lot more that I could say about all of this. I won't quite. I'm resisting doing that. Let's talk about the example of Warren Buffett as well. Now we have a different Saturn. This is part of the reason why I wanted to pick this chart as well. These are a good 1-2 punch on Saturn in the second. So instead of having Saturn with Pluto in his second house in Pisces, really questioning the materialism of it in the first place, Warren Buffett has Saturn in Capricorn, so a dignified Saturn, in retrograde in his second house. Now, with him, the relationship between his second house and his 8th house is also going to be very important, but the strategic and long-term patient nature of his attitude toward resources is what's really fundamental and really key here. Saturn takes a long view. Capricorn takes a long view. They're also really focused on building things up in a safe and secure and reasonable manner, and investing in things that have very good principles is a focus of his, So not get rich quick schemes at all. And what's very helpful about that Saturn is that he has an exalted Jupiter over with Pluto, and that combination is known for being very, very, very lucrative. But he has that with Mars up in his 8th house. So he is willing to take some risks, when it comes to his investments, and those are likely to pay off for sure. But with that Mars-Jupiter combination, that can be a bit risk-taking. So if he didn't have that Saturn looking at that Mars and kind of keeping it in check in terms of its influence on Jupiter and saying, look, I know that the outside world is really focused on taking action and doing quick trades. Wall Street is the investments are insanely fast, and like you got to be quick on your toes, et cetera, et cetera. That whole attitude was becoming more and more dominant, through this whole time that he's been a major investor. But he's definitely resistant to that kind of thing with that Saturn keeping that Mars in check, and therefore allowing for Jupiter and Pluto to guide him toward what is going to be a really powerful and lucrative investment for me to take, So making those powerful investments, resisting the urge to just make a bunch of quick decisions. But he's probably made some that have been quite helpful with that T-square between Mars and even Mercury, and then down to Saturn. He's probably made some quick moves that have paid off quite a bit. But that's not really what he's known for. What he's known for when it comes to his financial attitudes is patience and letting things grow, the cultivation, the slow but steady growth in that what is growing in his garden, basically, So very practical, very level-headed, not going to be willing to get too far out in front of his skis, and being extremely, extremely, extremely financially competent, basically. So Saturn in the 2nd house does not have to be financial complications. Marx had a lot of indications of that, and that was also definitely a choice that he made. Saturn in the 2nd can actually, especially post-Saturn return, can be really excellent at taking a long view and tending to something very slowly, very carefully, and very deliberately over the long term. And it is a stabilizing force. And so to have it in the house of security and safety can actually be incredibly helpful, especially if it's well dignified, like this one in Capricorn. And not to mention it's in a day chart, which is another consideration that helps out that Saturn. Now, here's a different kind of example that I wanted to use. Martha Stewart, again, very wealthy, but in a different way. She built her wealth through lifestyle and publication, basically, and like domestic attitudes, so it was very, very, very lifestyle based for her. And so for her, we have another Jupiter ruled 2nd house, but we have the moon there. For one thing, she probably values the living heck out of travel. That is a very standard read on the moon in Sag in the 2nd house, but also self-reliance. So building her own empire, being an entrepreneur in her own right in order to have complete freedom to make the moves that she's wanting to make and to push things in the directions that she feels that would be best to push them in, right? So that with Sagittarius there, not wanting to be told what to do when it comes to her finances and wanting to have a lot of maneuverability, but it being very important to her with the moon in the 2nd house that she does build a lot of safety and security and wealth for her. Now, she also, of course, the ruler is up in the 8th house, and so being able to tap into, especially with that in Gemini through publication, being able to tap into the talents, the skills, the resources of other people in order to create that empire, but also to kind of get people on board, customers, to be able to bring in a lot of customers and be able to build her wealth that way by having a lot, Jupiter in Gemini, a massive amount of customers, straightforwardly, of actual consumer items, right? But what I love the most about this is the domestic quality of the lifestyle that she's selling and the fact that that moon is in the 2nd house there. Now, the ruler of this house, being Jupiter out in Gemini, can already point to making money through publishing, and again, through having a lot of different customers, but because of the eighth house. But that moon in the second house also rules Mercury up in the ninth, which is another indication of publishing, and that being something that is able to be then brought into a second house thing, that she can make money through publishing as well. So that was another example that I really wanted to show. Now, additionally, she did get into some trouble through insider trading is one of the things that she's now kind of known for. And we do see a bit of her personal greed tarnishing some level of her reputation through the square of this moon to Neptune out in Virgo there. Now, she's mostly recovered that, that North Node is there with that Neptune, helping to really increase her profile regardless. I think a lot of people have kind of forgiven her about that. But there is that complication there of something that maybe she was trying to hide, becoming really public and very visible with that North Node conjoined to Neptune there, and making just a bad decision due to greed. We can even see a square to her reputation, Venus, in the 11th house as well. A big part of the social aspiration, a lot of our reputation is also in the 11th house, our social reputation. And the ruler of the second house is also in a square to that. So it's fascinating to me that is that little blip there. But this is a fun little example that I happened to run across when I was kind of looking for examples. I basically looked for people with Uranus in the second house. And this is a great example, I think this was one of the first ones that I clicked on. It was a great example of fluctuations financially, but it wound up being kind of even cuter than I thought it would be. So Johnny PayCheck was a country singer, and he had a bunch of hits. So he made some good money from what else but the ruler of the third house, Mercury, in Taurus, so a country singer, being something that is lucrative for him on a pretty high level with Uranus there. So that's all to be expected, pretty straightforward. But what's interesting is that we do have the South Node in the second house here. We have the North Node up in the 8th house. So that is an inherent note in his blueprint here. Hey, don't fuck around with debts, pay, put out there, focus on what you are owing to others, right? If you have a North Node in the 8th house, I would not recommend doing what he wound up doing at a certain point. But also the ruler of the second house is Venus, which is very close to the Imam Kuli. So keeping the security, the resources really close to home, close to his vest as well. Possibly over-identifying, maybe he did not have a lot of money coming up, and that can be an encouragement to hold on to things when they do wind up coming in. But he basically owed back taxes of quite a bit. And so he got into some trouble for that and wound up having to pay that back. He wound up having to file for bankruptcy then, and his debts were listed at more than $1.5 million at that point. He also had he got in trouble for some crime that he did too, some violent crime that he did that also put his career kind of on the back burner for a little bit too. And so we can see Uranus coming through and disrupting this area repeatedly. So on the one hand, we have surprising wealth coming in a good amount. So the highs are high, but the lows are pretty low as well. And so we can see those ups and downs. But what we can also see is the attitude toward safety and security and finances and income and things like that in what he sang about, in the content of the words of what he was singing about. And so he apparently did quite a bit of his songs were from a working class kind of a perspective, but his biggest selling single was called Take This Job and Shove It, which is just so Mercury and Uranus conjoined, that trickster that is, making this liberatory statement of screw you, I don't need you. I can just make a sudden change, and I'm perfectly willing to do that, kind of an attitude toward finances that was also, through him doing that, was also very lucrative for him to put that song out there, which it's so like wrapped up in itself. It's one of these fun little fractal representations that we can sometimes see in the blueprint, where Mercury conjoined to Uranus, saying something that is surprising and funny with regard to finances can actually make him quite a bit of finances, you know. But yeah, so that is all of the examples that I have. And I think that is pretty much what I have to say about the second house at this point. So I really hope that this was helpful and gave some sense of broader perspective on the second house and the notions that have come down to us through the various traditions, how we can utilize it, what we can see in it, and offers through the metaphor of the garden an easier way of kind of accessing all of those different things in one. So if you have any other questions or anything like that, definitely feel free to let me know. And otherwise than that, thank you so much for spending this time with me.